Okay, well, I am extremely humbled to be here. Really grateful to be able to join this amazing festival. You guys have done an amazing job. I think made everyone feel welcome, and the birding has been pretty phenomenal as well. I'm very jealous of the golden winged warblers and the Lawrence's warblers, and those will have to wait for another time for me, I guess. But yeah, really happy to be here. And I am, let's see here, is this going to work? Well, I can't seem to advance my slide. There we go. Maybe I'll try this. Okay. Let me just make sure. There we go. All right. So this is obviously a different kind of title for a talk than probably most of you are accustomed to, I hope. I've given this talk a number of times before, and I keep tinkering with it as the time goes on. I always like to remind people at the start of this talk that this is a talk about birds, okay? It's a talk about birds. If you came here expecting it to be on another topic, this would be a very awkward time for you to get up and leave. So, but yeah, thanks. Thanks for being a little risque with the subject matter tonight. Before I titled this talk, I thought long and hard about it as to whether this was even a good idea. I still question it pretty routinely, but I thought, if I name it ornithology, the birds and the bees, people might think I'm strange or, weird, perverted even, or worse. And then I thought, well, a lot of the people that know me already think of me that way. And for those that don't really know me, they would have attended a talk called Ornithology, the birds and the bees. And I feel like that would say as much about them as it would say about me. So I feel like we're in good company here. But yeah, I think one of the ways the talk came to me is, right, we're curious observers. We go out looking for birds, trying to see beautiful things. We end up seeing strange things, beautiful things, odd things, terrible things sometimes, grotesque things. We're intent observers, and we can kind of end up being peeping toms by accident. Raise your hand here if you've ever seen a bird in copulation, bird copulating. Peeping toms, all of you, all of you. Yeah, shame on you, shame on you. Yeah. But I was leading a tour, and Andy will appreciate this. I was in Morocco, and I was leading a trip, and Morocco is a wonderful country for birding, but it's all kinds of different desert there. There's kind of stony desert, there's sand desert, there's a bunch of different kinds of desert. And I was in one of these kind of stony desert regions, and I was like, geez, there are no birds here. I got to find something to show somebody that would be of interest, And I kind of saw in the distance these like row of scrubby bushes. And I thought, man, if there's birds here anywhere, that's where they're going to be. They're going to be hiding in the shade of those scrubby bushes. So after we got checked in and everything, I said, all right, folks, we're going to go out to these scrubby bushes. And we're just going to, if there's birds anywhere, this is where they're going to be, And we get out there, and sure enough, there's rufous-tailed scrub robins running around in there, and there's some warblers. I think there's like Sardinian warblers and maybe a Mousier's redstart, some really nice Morocco birds. And, we sat there probably 15, 20 minutes, just different things popping up. And all of a sudden, after, we'd been there about 15 or 20 minutes, a couple of people stand up, and we realized that they've been there the entire time looking for a little privacy. And we were completely oblivious to them. They were like slightly hidden, and we weren't looking for people, we were looking for birds, and they just kind of made a very awkward exit past us. And that really drove home the peeping Tom thing, which happens again and again when you're birding. Talk to people that live in New York and go birding in Central Park or Prospect Park. They see all kinds of stuff. I won't bore you with those details. But here we are again. This is a pair of bristle-thighed curlews up in Nome in Alaska. This is one of the hardest birds to see in North America. You know, there's black rail, yellow rail. Those are tricky, right? But this is a bird with a pretty restricted range. You gotta hike up there, you know, to know them. You got to get up on Coffee Dome, and then you can spend hours there all day, even this time, you know, in June, and you could still not see them. And these birds, they winter in Oceania, you know, out in the middle of the Pacific. And then they migrate, you know, across the Pacific Ocean to breed up in this Arctic tundra. And I was, you know, I just thought of this, like, you know, these birds, they're in the middle of nowhere, but here we come with our binoculars and our telescopes and our cameras and everything, and they can't get a moment's peace from us. So yeah, whether intentional or not, you know, this happens, these peeping toms. So, and another thing that happened while I was in Alaska on a tour a few years ago, we went out to this place called Potter Marsh, just outside of Anchorage. It's actually a good place to look for red-winged blackbird if you're looking for red-winged blackbird for your Alaska list, because the rest of that tour route, you don't really see a whole lot of them. And it's a good place for Harlan's hawk sometimes as well. And I was there with the tour group, and we saw, you know, a few things here and there, terns and ducks, and we're enjoying the birds, and a couple of guys that are just enjoying, you know, hiking on the boardwalk, not really birders, come up behind us, and they're kind of just enjoying watching us birders do our thing. They're like, huh, what are you guys seeing? You know, I kind of told them, you know, some terns, some ducks and stuff. And somebody goes, oh, there's a harrier over there. And everyone kind of, you know, raises their binoculars quietly, and we're just looking, and someone says, it's a male. And one of the bystanders that had just walked up says, wow, I can barely see the bird, and they can see its gonads. So this was a person obviously unfamiliar with sexual dimorphism, which is the phenotypic differences between males and females, including morphology, ornamentation, and behavior. They don't always look different, but they can behave differently too. And this is kind of the two typical adult plumages, right? There's juveniles as well. They're buffier below, but this is a, you know, typical gray ghost on the left here, very pale, beautiful gray ghost. And the females are kind of larger, streakier brown, but paler around the belly. And there's a number of birds that are sexually dimorphic. You know, there's, I forget what the numbers are now. It's, you know, this is changing all the time, but I think it was like close to 40% of birds are sexually dimorphic. So a lot are not, but there are birds like many of our North American hummingbirds, and even quite a few in the neotropics, is beautiful, big pink gorget and crown and cheeks. And also the female over on the very beautiful and a big sturdy hummingbird, but not quite as pink around the head, really hardly at all. And the rufous hummingbirds, right? Rufous hummingbirds, a pretty striking example. The males are really orange, and the females have some orange highlights, but, you know, not as orange as the males. A lot of different songbirds are sexually dimorphic. The passerina buntings, you know, painted bunting, blue grosbeak, indigo bunting, varied bunting, lazuli bunting. Here's a couple of varied buntings. On the left is the male, on the right is the female. She's just kind of evenly brown, and he's obviously sort of some rich purple and blue and red. And then there's the fairy wrens from Australia, strikingly sexually dimorphic, right? The male is white blue, and the female's more brown with some blue in the tail and some red in the face. A lot of different songbirds. A lot of our ducks are sexually dimorphic as well. Here you got the widgeon on the bottom, female on the left, male on the right, and the canvasbacks. These birds are like sexually dimorphic, but not as striking maybe as some others. You can see that they look very different, but they also have kind of similar patterning. The most famous bird in the world, I would advance, the chicken, the red jungle fowl, Gallus gallus, strikingly different. A lot of game birds actually are strongly sexually dimorphic. Many of the game birds are. And then here's an example of a species that is a little less so. They are different. They are different in behavior. They take different postures. This is the male is on the right. The female is on the left. This is blue-footed booby. I took this in the Galapagos some years ago, and the male is got a smaller pupil. I don't know if you can see that, might be a little hard to see, but the male has a smaller pupil, female's got a bigger pupil, and the female actually tends to have brighter bare parts, so the feet are often brighter on the female, but the male does this dance, right, where he waves his feet around and then she arches her back and throws those wings out to the side, and they make different sounds during this as well. So they look sort of generally similar, but they actually have some notable differences as well. Now, you've noticed so far, there's been a lot of talk about how the males are kind of flashier looking overall. And that is often the case. Females do a lot of the choosing when it comes to bird selection, to mate selection. But there are some examples, what people sometimes call reverse sexual dimorphism, where the females are the more colorful, more aggressive, more territorial, and provide less parental care in the pairing. That happens in a number of birds as well. The phalaropes are a famous example. The jacanas, there's a bronze-winged jacana on the upper right there from India. And then there's the eclectus parrots, where they more or less share nest duties, but you can see the females bright, bright red. They're both pretty good looking, but striking example. And even our spotted sandpiper, the females are showier and more aggressive and don't really do much in the way of parental care. And it is pretty interesting when you start reviewing the literature. In examples where males have more than one mate, they will say a male may acquire more than one, additional mates. Whereas if it's a female that does that, she'll be described as notoriously promiscuous. You do see this bias again and again. More and more, I think we're getting away from that, thankfully. But it is entertaining at times to see, just kind of crazy. This is something I would absolutely love to see someday. Gynandromorphs are an example. They happen a lot in insects, butterflies, and birds as well, where organisms that show characters of both male and female characteristics. Bilateral gynandromorphs is what you're seeing here. This is all those 6 pictures are the same cardinal. This is a bird I've never seen before, but I would die to see one of these. Basically looks exactly like a female on the right, and on the left it looks exactly like a male. So just depending on which way it's facing, you might think it was one or the other. But then when it faces you straight ahead, you see it's just like split right down the middle. There's other famous examples. The Academy of Natural Sciences of Philly, we have an orchard oriole that's a bilateral gynandromorph. Really cool specimen if you ever get there and get a chance to see. Kestrels, it's been seen in kestrels a number of times. And famously, there was a vagrant black-throated blue warbler to California, really good bird out there. And there was one that showed up that was a bilateral gynandromorph, sort of like an uber rarity, So that was pretty cool. So you get one of these at your feeder, let me know. I'll come chase it. Love to see that. So I wanted to think about these 2 questions. Maybe I'll query you guys shortly on number 1 here. But consider these ducks here, right? These are 2 closely related species. Actually used to be one species until just a few years ago. I'm not even sure all the taxonomists have caught up to the change here, but Mexican ducks and mallards, very closely related. And mallards look strikingly different from one another, right? But here you have Mexican ducks, basically they were considered the same species, like I say, just a couple of years ago. And the males and females look more or less the same. The male is on the right there. He's got a yellower bill than the female. She's got sort of a splotchy black and orange bill. But aside from that, they look very similar. So maybe I'll put the question. Any volunteers to try to answer the first question? Then we'll move on to why we think sexual dimorphism occurs in some species, but not in others. But anyone want to volunteer to suggest why males often are more colorful than females? No? Yes. That's right. Females choose the mate, and also often they are, oh, thanks, John. They often are doing a lot of the nest duties, right? They're often incubating in many cases, and it behooves them to be more camouflaged. Now, this was a long-held theory. It's being, as time goes on, it is less and less true. I feel like that's true of all of our understanding of bird behavior. But also the females do a lot of the choosing, and they drive a lot of the selection. Yeah, so here it is. Females like snazzy males, sexual selection, and females often need camouflage while they're on the nest. And here you have this lek of greater prairie chickens where you can see the males with their inflated neck sacs and their erectile neck feathers. And were this a video, you'd see them stamping around, performing an incredible dance. So the females not only like them to look snazzy, but they perform these incredibly regimented, stereotyped dances. Hopefully some of you have seen this. I've actually never seen it myself, but they like good dancers as well, apparently. That's a big thing. And this is, I would say, one of the greatest spectacles in North America that I think like non-birders should be made aware of how cool these grouse are. I don't think you have to be a birder to go to one of these leks and not be blown away by what you see of a greater sage grouse or a sharp-tailed grouse or these prairie chickens. If you haven't done it, highly recommend doing it. And this is a famous example of sexual selection. This is the long-tailed widowbird. Guy named Anderson, a couple decades back, he was looking at these birds, and probably some of you are probably looking at this thinking, man, that looks a lot like a red-winged blackbird. And it does, right? Looks pretty similar. They even have similar habitats, and they have similar behavior. They kind of like marshy habitats, and the males basically stake out an area, they defend it, and then they try to attract as many females to that territory as they can. Female is on the left there. She's kind of streaky brown, sort of like a red-winged blackbird. And so Anderson was looking at these and he's thinking, yeah, why all the tail? You know, that would seem to be maladaptive. You know, if you're like, what if there's a hawk around, a predator? You would think that tail you would think wouldn't do you any good. So he did an experiment. He captured a bunch of these things, these long-tailed widowbirds. And he actually cut the tails off, not entirely, but of some of the males. He cut off the tails. Don't worry, they grow back the next year, so they'll be all right. I know it sounds bad, but he cut off the tails of several of them. So he had these short-tailed males. He had these regular, normal length tails. And then he took the parts that he cut off and he glued them to some other normals. So he had some uber long-tailed males. 3 groups, right? Short tail, normal tail, uber long tails. And then he decided to, see who the females chose. Begging the question, does size matter? And the answer is, in this case, as you probably all have guessed, that the females definitely went for the longer tail. It was a sign of fitness. If they can manage to fly around, and this, a lot of these birds are in South Africa or, sub-Saharan Africa, predators all over the place, hawks, all sorts of stuff. If they can manage with an uber long tail, then, they must be doing something right, I guess. So the normal-tailed males actually did fine as well. The long-tailed males did better than they did, but the short-tailed males really had a tough time. They did not do nearly as well. So that's a famous example. Now look, turning back to the question of why sexual dimorphism occurs in some species, but not in others. Consider these 2 species of orioles here. We have Bullock's oriole, male and female there in the middle. And then on the right is an Altamira oriole. And basically what you have is in the tropics, very often, these birds, they don't migrate, right? Like a bird like an Altamira oriole, a pair gets together, they pair up, they stake out a territory, and they're not just defending it for a couple months, but they're defending it all year. There's not really a lot of benefit to them looking a whole lot different from one another. And in fact, the more colorful they are, the better they would be proven to defend their territory. So the males and females look the same on the Altamira oriole. We can't tell that bird on the lower right, if it's a male or female from looking at it. You could maybe tell from behavior a little bit. But Bullock's orioles, they migrate down to Mexico and southern Central America. And they have to then, come back in spring, ready to breed. And they don't have a lot of time. They got 3-4 months, maybe something like that, maybe a little longer. They got to recognize each other pretty quickly. They got to know who to breed with. They got to know who to run off. And what they found too is that they actually feed in discrete areas. So they actually don't concentrate. The males and females feed in separate areas, which is probably not surprising, like cedar waxwings, right? Anything that turns red or orange, carotenoids are a big thing in terms of often in the diet, determining how red or orange something is. So these these females probably steer away from some of the redder fruits and stuff that maybe some of the males would go for. So, you know, if you're a migratory bird, it's more helpful to be sexually dimorphic a lot of the time. Same for the mallards, right? The mallards are one of the most widespread birds in the Northern Hemisphere, all across Eurasia and North America. Obviously now there's a lot of mallards you see that don't really go anywhere. Those are domesticated ones, but traditionally it's a migratory species. They cover a lot of ground, and Mexican ducks are pretty much resident. They wander a little bit, but not much. So kind of the same deal there. There's other factors, but these are in terms of determining sexual dimorphism, but this is one example of why they might. I'll bet you this is a question that you guys are asked by your non-birding friends. People ask me this question quite a bit. They'll see a pair of birds like eagles or a pair of warblers and say, do they mate for life? You know, which I think it's because these birds are so beautiful, so majestic. We want to believe that, you know, there's even more romance than you could possibly imagine. But obviously it's you know, it's sort of a human construct that we're kind of foisting on these birds. There are some birds that form long-term pair bonds and may nest together for a decade, 2 decades, maybe sometimes more, particularly larger waterfowl, swans, maybe geese in some cases, seabirds, albatrosses, you know, they'll take long-term pair bonds, maybe some of the larger raptors. But a lot of the small birds, they don't, you know, they're not around that long. They might have 3 or 4 attempts in the season. They gotta do what they gotta do, and they gotta do it quick and get it done and pass on those genes. So they sometimes are not necessarily monogamous. And you know, there's many examples, but seabirds are a particularly interesting one. They have a lot of really ritualized courtship because, you know, they live a long time. They have a very low reproductive success rate. So they invest a lot in the courtship, in trying to make sure they're actually going to have somebody who's going to stick around and do the feeding, share the duties, because you know, a lot of these seabirds take a long time to fledge. So cheating, as it is, the EPC, the extra pair copulation, there's about 248 bird families in the world. It's been documented in almost all of them now. I'm sure there's some it has not been documented, but in the end, right, there's only a few ways to do this. There's monogamy, polygyny, which means a male with many females, and polyandry, a female with many males, and then polygynandry, which means that it's basically a good time. Everybody's having a great time, multiple mates, you know, it's the 60s all over again, I suppose. No offense to anybody here, but yeah, and the salt marsh sparrow is here because it's a famous example where they don't really have territories. They kind of have home ranges, and basically it's a little bit of a free for all. And there's even within monogamy, you know, there's various different kinds. There's seasonal monogamy, where maybe a pair of birds would nest together for the season, and then the following season they would take a different mate. And then there's other birds, you know, that have 3 or 4 breeding attempts in a season, smaller birds often, and they might take a different mate even within that season. Talking a little bit about pair formation. You know, we're going to talk about a couple of ways that happens. There's visual displays and vocal displays. Often they're melded together, but sometimes the species will really lean on one rather than the other. I've picked a couple good-looking tanagers here from South America because they don't really make a lot of interesting sounds, but they sure are gorgeous, right? And I haven't actually done any study on this, but I'm just thinking that I've heard these birds in the field, and they don't sound like much. A couple little chips and twitters here and there from the canopy, but otherwise they're not a very interesting, you know, group of birds vocally. And I think basically they must key in visually on each other mostly. Then you look at a bird like a Baird sparrow or a meadowlark, right? Or an upland sandpiper, these birds that breed out in the prairies, open country, they got to project their sound. Or think about Carolina wrens, you know, or any wren almost, or the thrushes, you know, often they're in denser woodlands. They got to really belt it out to make sure they have really complex, beautiful, interesting songs. But often it seems like if you're a cryptic bird, you've got a good sound, not necessarily the other way around, but often it does seem that way. Thinking about visual displays, I always like to look at this. This is actually, I think, about a third of the different visual displays I found listed for wood ducks. Wood duck is obviously one of the best looking birds in the world. On the cover of that Pennsylvania book, I think, because it's a good representative for Pennsylvania, I think, the wood duck. And yeah, I mean, looking at this list, some of you may be looking for some tips. what what to do for next Valentine's Day or your anniversary or what have you. And there's some good stuff here. There's inciting, which sounds kind of exciting. Mutual preening sounds pretty romantic, right? Bathing sounds at least prudent, if not, potentially sensual. There's the coquette call, which to me, kind of recalls something maybe a little erotic. And then there's the old burp whistle. Not sure what that sounds like, but if you are looking for pointers, I'd probably steer clear of that one. Yeah, and there's some really cool displays you see at Lex. And there's a couple different kinds of Lex we're going to talk about here. This is a famous lekking species, the Guianan cock of the rock, just found in Guyana and Venezuela and sort of northern South America. Species I've not yet seen actually yet. I've seen the Indian cock of the rock, and we saw them, and it looked pretty. We saw them at a lek, and it was quite similar to what you see in this painting here. They kind of need to do a painting because the forest is really dense where these cock of the rocks get together. And basically, what it is a red light district where the males all get together and they all posture, and they make some sounds, but the postures are pretty wild, and they really are showing off for the female. That's the female in the upper left there. And she comes in basically just, to size stuff up, see who's looking good. And she is not showing up here, looking for a long-term meaningful relationship. She's basically here to try to find a fit male and then, and then move on. And that's about the extent of their relationship. Typically, the males don't do much in the way of parental care. There's a couple different lekking species. We mentioned the grouse. That's a famous one. The violet ears, they're a famous lekking group. And one of the most famous ones is this bird called the kakapo, which is a great bird name, right? The kakapo. But it is a parrot from southern New Zealand. It occurs only in the Fiordlands. It's one of the most inaccessible places in the world. And there's only I think there's only about 150 of these things or less. Their numbers have been really increasing. They've done tremendous conservation work. Soon, it's a bird virtually no one in the world has seen, aside from the researchers who study them, the kakapo. But it's actually getting to a point where maybe in the near future, we'll be able to go and look for the only flightless parrot in the world, the heaviest parrot in the world, and a bird whose call can be heard from over a mile away. And in the fjords, they're basically on sort of these cliff islands, with big fjords between them. So these birds, need to be able to hear each other from all around. Bronzed cowbird, actually, here in North America is an example of the bird that uses the exploded lek. It's a lek that is driven less by visual display and more by sound. That is true of the kakapo as well. Obviously, there's a lot of bronzed cowbirds around within the range and far fewer of the kakapo. So I thought we'd just take a little view of this video here, and maybe you can see why the kakapo might struggle to breed at times.
Hey, matey. Oh, look at you.
Aren't you the best?
That is just fantastic.
It ought to be impossible to describe a creature as looking old-fashioned, but that's exactly how Sirocco looks, with his big sideburns and his Victorian gentleman's face.
It's actually nice just seeing him wandering around in the forest undergrowth.
You can see he's got very good camouflage.
Yeah, that colour is
So, evolution hasn't entirely rendered him useless.
Hello. You're going to look in the lens.
A typical male, Sirocco is clearly only interested in one thing.
Hello.
Oh, look at that.
Ow. God, he's got sharp claws.
He's getting a bit frisky.
Ow. Ow.
Do you think it is he's actually attempting a sort of mating ritual? He is. Oh, Ruff. You are being shagged.
Or not. Ow. God, it's sharp.
Look, he's so happy.
Sorry. One of the funniest things I've ever seen. You are being shagged by a rare parrot. He thinks you are. Ow! He's really going for it. Wow, you've chosen him? Is it actually, you were in pain, aren't you?
That's all right.
Oh, his neck is covered.
Am I? He's fine, but it's really sharp.
Did that hurt?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got blood there and blood there and blood there. We should patch you up, to be honest, because it's not good. But
Well,
I want you to call the chick. When you have the chick, I want you to call it Stephen for me. Would you do that?
I'm not sure how to take that.
Egg will come out of your mouth. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the television first. You've seen Mark Carwardine, who has devoted his life to conserving animals, actually taking an active part in the conservation and breeding of a whole new generation, of a whole new species, Homo cacapens. He's going to give birth to a little kakapo. We're very proud of you.
Do you want to have a go?
I think I'll pass, actually.
So yeah, that's the cock. Might be my favorite lecking species. And I'm sure some of you have seen this even here in Pennsylvania, but maybe you've seen ones that look like the females in the upper right. Maybe you've seen some of the males. The males have these crazy Elizabethan collars, and they do wild dances when they're on the breeding grounds. Not usually around here do you see them do this, but you might still get to see them looking pretty showy. But ruffs are interesting in a couple different ways. As shorebirds go, and well, as lecking species go, their displays are directed towards other males mostly. That's usually not the case. Usually they're trying to display for the females. In Ruff's case, the species name is Philomachus pugnax, right? Philomachus means battle loving, and pugnax refers to their pugnacious nature. They're really an aggressive bird. And so they're basically always trying to duke it out and outdo one another. And that's what you see. And so it's unusual in that they do this, that they display mostly for other males. It's also unusual in that the males, basically no two look the same. You've got red ones, white ones. You see a white one on the lower right there. The one in the middle kind of facing the other one is trying to intimidate it. Looks like it's got a mostly black collar. And you see, those are kind of the three main ones, but you also see salt and pepper ones that are kind of mixed, and they kind of no two look the same. And so that's what they do. And there's kind of three types of males. You have these territorial males, and that represents over 80%. I think it's about 85%. And they're the main ones in the lek. It's sort of like a gladiator arena where they're in there and they're duking it out, and they're really getting aggressive with each other, trying to dominate the other males so that they can secure matings with the females. And then you have these satellite males, which are, the territorial males tend to be more black collared or red collared. The satellite males tend to have white collars or be the salt and pepper ones. And they kind of fringe around and they mostly stay out of the main part of the lek. Sometimes you get 20, 30 males or more in one of these leks. So it can be pretty impressive from what I'm told. I've never actually been to one of the leks, but I've seen some videos. And then there's another male that's called the fader male. And the fader male looks exactly like a female, like that bird in the upper right there. And there's really no way to tell them from the females. But they hang around with the females at the margins of the lek, and they basically engage in sort of sneaky copulations because the males think, well, I don't have to worry about that one, and we don't have to worry about being aggressive and trying to drive that one away. But in fact, the fader males have testes that are 2.5 times larger than the other males. So maybe they should worry, who knows? But it's a fascinating group of birds, the ruffs. We'll talk a little bit about vocal sounds, and probably a lot of you know that birds have this organ called the syrinx. And I'm not going to get into it too much here, but there's a nice little graphic of it on the right there. You can see where it's located between the trachea and the bronchus. In the blue diagram there, you can see it's just above the lungs and kind of at the base of the trachea there. The songbirds have a more complex syrinx, but both non-passerines and passerines can make pretty complex songs. It just depends on the bird. And I thought I'd play a couple sounds here, just real quick. It's a couple of my favorite sounds. Let's start with this white bellbird. I just think it's such a cool sound. Sounds very mechanical, right? Imagine hearing that in the jungle of northern Brazil. And this sound would carry for well over a mile. Bellbirds in general make great sounds. Trying to play it again here. So. It's hard to believe that comes out of a bird, you know? Now I'm going to play a song from a bird that I'm going to guess that nobody here will recognize, but it's a bird you all know very, very well. I'll be impressed if somebody gets it right. Oh, no. Okay, here we go. Time. No, Joe, no, yeah. Any guesses, anybody? Yeah. Yeah. No, although I do have that one. I was thinking of playing that one. Yeah, I'll play that one next for you. Yeah. No, it's not. Sorry. No, good guess though. Also, this is a snowy egret at a heronry. Yeah, it sounds sort of like a baby in a bathtub, right? It's like. Ridiculous. Yeah. And I'll play a sound for you guys that I'll bet everybody heard today, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs we got. Like Thoreau wrote about thrushes, hermit thrushes and wood thrushes in particular. This is a wood thrush. And he said that the wood thrush exalted him, lifted his spirit. And Walt Whitman has written about the songs of thrushes, Amy Clampett. Quite a few writers have written about how much they love thrush songs. And the North American thrushes really do make some beautiful sounds. That's one of my favorites. I'd like to contrast that with this sound from the Great Bustard. This is the song. You getting the gist, or should I play it one more time? Yes. Yeah. Here we go. That was a good one. Yeah. 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 That's the Great Bustard. To some female out there, she's thinking that sounds really good. You know, that's a really nice song right there. Yeah. Yeah. Hard to believe, but there you have it. So I have the Will of Ptarmigan. I'm going to play it for you, even though I hadn't planned to play this, but the title of this track is A Bagel. You hear him? He really wants that bagel. Keen on his morning bagel. So yeah, now with these bird sounds, right? Usually trying to do two things, trying to tell other males that they've got a territory. We're finding out more and more now, of course, that females are very much involved in song, not usually to the degree that males are, but a lot of females sing more and more. But they're trying to attract females and drive away males, usually, or just to maintain a territory. Now, when it comes to the act itself, how do they do it? Well, this is kind of what it looks like a lot of the time. And usually it's pretty brief. You know, you get male pops up, he's got his cloacal protuberance, presses it to the female's cloaca, and usually it's pretty quick and dirty. And there's not, you know, no points for longevity typically, but this is what you see. There are some exceptions to this, however. Now, the grebes, they don't do very well on land. So they will usually build little floating platforms, which I think is pretty artistic. You have to admire them for that, you know. They build platforms for nesting, but they actually will sometimes build separate platforms just for mating. On the lower left, there's a hooded grebe, one of the most endangered birds in the world, really handsome one too, with an incredible display. Definitely Google hooded grebe display later on. Highly recommend doing that. Crazy. You think Western grebes are good, or, you know, these guys really do some crazy stuff. So grebes, they make their own little rafts, you know, for copulation. You got ducks who usually do it in the water, and ducks we're mostly avoiding today because ducks are gross. They really do a lot of weird stuff. They actually have penises. This lake duck was discovered years ago for having a 20-centimeter long penis, and they're corkscrew shaped. Mostly it's hard to talk about ducks in a way that isn't gross or really odd. So I'm going to leave that for somebody else to do. But this lake duck, you know, the ostrich has a shorter appendage than the lake duck does. Just saying, it's pretty bizarre. But they copulate typically in the water. And then on the middle at the bottom is a bird called the stitchbird. You know, most birds, right? We showed the stilts here. This is what most birds do. Stitchbirds actually face each other while they copulate. That's a monotypic bird family. The stitchbird is only found in New Zealand, and it's the only bird in its family. And so far, I think it's the only one that's been documented where they copulate face to face like that. And then there's swifts, the ultimate aerialists. The next time somebody asks you, who gives a flying? That's the answer right there. Swifts do. They do it in the air. They do it in the air. You got to hand it to them. The oldest profession. We're getting into the weird and wild stuff here as we wind down here. I kind of finished up with some champions here. So yeah, the oldest profession, harlotry, if you will, for lack of a better term. There are birds that will exchange goods or gifts for copulations. The purple-throated carib, a Caribbean hummingbird, they are extremely territorial of their flowering bushes. But there are certain females that they will not drive away from their bushes, provided that a certain arrangement can be agreed upon. The Adelie penguins, you see those little pebbles these things are so far south, there's no vegetation really. There's like some sunburst lichens around, and maybe there's like 1 or 2 plants that can actually grow that far south where these things are. There's basically nothing for them to nest with aside from these pebbles. They actually have to tell visitors that come to these colonies, don't take the rocks, because you get people like, oh, I just want to take a rock home, you know. But these rocks are super valuable to these Adelie penguins. And so we saw this. I was just there in November, December last year, and you see males that will go and steal a rock from one, you know, untended nest who's, you know, out feeding or something, give it to another female. And after, like, you know, whose mate is off feeding someplace, and after 7 or 12 rocks or whatever, you'll see them in delecto flagrante. So that it happens. This is a rough one. Every now and then you see birds that are just so hopped up on hormones that they literally get nasty. And this is a case of a golden-cheeked warbler that has actually gone and killed another male golden-cheeked warbler. And to the point that the person that took these photos went over and after they'd witnessed this and picked it up, and the male still came and landed on his hand and still kept hammering away at this golden-cheeked warbler after it was long dead. Just shows you what can happen with hormones sometimes, and probably a combination of a pretty nasty disposition. Dunnock, or the hedge sparrow, is a famous example of sperm competition. Again, sort of like the ducks. We're not going to get too deep in the weeds on that one, but they are kind of like the salt marsh sparrow. It's, free for all. Everybody, multiple mates for everybody, males, females. It's just chaos, and they will often mate 100 times in a day. Oyster catcher, so serene, so beautiful, right? American oyster catcher. They have discovered that American oyster catchers, the females have their mated male that they produce their young with, but they very often have a multi-year relationship with another male that they simply copulate with. And like 97% of their young, their eggs and their young come from their mated pair, but they just, have a good old time with, their other friend as well. Pretty wild, pretty cool. Good for them. Smith's longspur on the lower right there, pretty close relative of the, well, very close relative of the Lapland longspur to the left. The Smith's longspur, though, was once counted copulating 629 times in 6.5 days. Imagine being the graduate student, just had to sit there with a clicker. That would be a thankless job if ever there was one. I mean, after 40, wouldn't you just be like, all right, it's a lot, Yeah, man. Yeah, these oyster catchers they'll copulate 300 or 400 times in a season sometimes with their non-social mate. Pretty interesting stuff. And the Smith longspurs have testes that are twice the size of their close relative, the Lapland longspur, as well. More work to be done there, no doubt. These are kind of my ultimate finishing champs here, if you will. They get points for longevity. The Vesa parrot, Madagascar, they have been clocked copulating for 1.5 hours at times, in captivity though. 1.5 hours, that's pretty impressive for a bird. But I think the fiery-throated hummingbird has been clocked copulating for close to 1 hour. And that's a hummingbird. Like, that's a lot of calories for a hummingbird. And that's like 1 hour represents a pretty good chunk of its life, So I tip my hat to the fiery-throated hummingbird of Costa Rica and Panama. So that's my presentation, but if you're still awake in Jonesin for more, here are a couple really good resources. There's even more all the time. There's such good reading on this, but these are a couple really good books. There's The Sex Lives of Birds now as well. Yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff, but I really loved Evolution's Rainbow by Joan Ruff-Garden, excellent book. And The Private Lives of Birds is a good one as well. I want to thank these folks, and these are my sources. And a couple trips coming up: Colombia this July, think about it, India in February. Thank you guys so much for letting me do this presentation. Sure. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'll do. This is a rich topic. I know what I know. It's limited, but I'm willing to take a stab at whatever questions you might have. Any questions, anybody? Yes. Yes, yeah, birds of prey are famous for that, and a lot of birds, the males are bigger or they're close. Raptors, the females tend to be quite a bit larger. There's various theories for that. My understanding is that they haven't really figured out exactly why. One of the theories is that the males provision the young when they're smaller with smaller prey, and then as the young get larger, the female can then leave the nest and procure larger prey for them. Some people have disputed whether that's really the case or not. But yeah, there's some where the size discrepancy is really noticeable, and it can go either way. Anybody else? Yes, The Private Lives of Birds. Yeah, by Bridget Stutchbury. Yeah. Oh, really? She spoke here. Nice. Yeah, that's a great book. She did a tremendous job. That. Yeah, rich topic. If you've come across any more cool, weird bird breeding stuff, let me know. Yeah, I'm always trying to add to this talk, so appreciate it. Yes. That's a good question. Apparently both are present. Yeah. She was asking, what do the sex parts of the bilateral gynandromorph look like? My understanding is on the bilateral ones, they are both there. Yeah. Okay, thanks everybody so much. Appreciate it.
That really wraps up our evening. Thank you again, George, for the presentation. And I'll say enjoy your field trips.